Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. This time, we're really diving into some seriously intense history. We're talking about the Cold War, specifically the nuclear arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Now, this is a period where, let's be honest, the stakes couldn't have been higher, right? We're talking about the threat of global annihilation looming large over everything.
Yeah, and it's something that even decades later still has that power to just fascinate us, frighten us.
Absolutely.
The decisions that were made, the risks that were taken during that era, I mean, they echo even now.
They resonate, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you've shared some fascinating sources with us to kind of dig into this, and it seems like the best place to start is really right at the beginning, 1945.
Right.
The world is still reeling from World War II, and then the U.S. drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
I mean, talk about an event that just completely changes the global power dynamic, like, overnight.
Oh, absolutely. And you have to remember, these bombings, they weren't just, acts of war.
Right.
They were this terrifying demonstration of this totally new destructive power that the world had never, ever seen before.
Unthinkable.
Yeah, really.
Really unthinkable.
Yeah.
And the Soviets, they must have felt the heat immediately.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They recognized in that moment their own vulnerability.
Right.
And they knew that they had to acquire this weapon.
So that's it. That's the starting pistol.
Exactly.
For the arms race.
The arms race is on.
It begins right there.
Yeah.
And it takes off with this, terrifying speed, going from atomic to hydrogen bombs in just a few years.
Yeah.
The U.S. tests the first H-bomb in 1952, the Soviets not far behind in 53.
53, yeah.
It's wild how quickly things escalated.
It is really a sign, I think,
Yeah.
of the fear and paranoia
Yeah.
that gripped both of these superpowers.
Right.
Because each side felt like
Yeah.
they had to match or even surpass the other one's capabilities.
Right.
Driven by this really chilling logic
Yeah.
that if you fall behind,
Right.
you are ultimately vulnerable.
You're done.
Yeah.
So to prevent a war, you have to be capable of unthinkable destruction.
That's the thinking at the time, yeah.
That's a terrifying...
It is.
Yeah.
That's the chilling logic of mutually assured destruction, or as we call it, MAD.
Right.
Essentially, the theory was that if both sides have this massive, massive nuclear arsenal,
Right.
it would actually prevent either side from attacking
Interesting.
out of fear of,
Total annihilation.
total annihilation, yeah.
So no one starts a nuclear war because everybody loses.
Yeah,
It's just a high-stakes gamble
it's a terrifying gamble.
with the fate of the world hanging in the balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to really drive the point home,
Yeah.
in 1954,
Okay.
under President Eisenhower, the U.S. adopted this policy called massive retaliation.
Okay.
So basically what that meant was any Soviet aggression, no matter how small, how big,
Right.
could actually trigger a full-scale
Oh.
nuclear response.
Wow.
So imagine the tension
Yeah.
of living in a time where you knew
Yeah.
that any even minor miscalculation
Right.
could lead to those unimaginable consequences.
It's a chilling thought.
It is. It is.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah.
So with this kind of backdrop of just immense tension,
Yeah.
were there any attempts to ease the tension, to find some kind of middle ground?
There were these glimmers of hope for diplomacy.
Okay.
At the 1955 Geneva summit,
Okay.
President Eisenhower, he proposes this open skies policy.
Okay.
The idea was to allow for mutual surveillance
Right.
between the U.S. and the Soviet Union as a way to build,
Trust.
a little trust. Exactly.
Transparency, right.
Transparency. Yeah, why not?
Seems like a good idea on the surface, at least.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And it kind of gets to the heart of this whole Cold War mindset.
Right.
Because the Soviets saw this as just another ploy
Yeah.
for the U.S. to gather intelligence
Yeah.
on their capabilities.
Of course.
And they ultimately rejected it.
Wow.
Which just highlights that deep mistrust that kind of defined the Cold War.
Right.
Even a proposal like this that, on the surface seems pretty reasonable,
Totally.
is met with suspicion
Yeah.
and ultimately rejected.
Wow. It's a shame because it seemed like a genuine attempt
It did.
at de-escalation.
It seemed like it.
But it just wasn't in the cards, I guess, at that
Yeah,
point. Not at that point.
So the arms race continues.
It does.
Both sides are locked in this, deadly embrace.
Yeah.
Fueled by fear, by ideology, by mistrust.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It really is, yeah.
It is.
And then 1957, something happens that just throws gasoline on an already raging fire.
Yeah. Sputnik.
Sputnik.
Tell us about Sputnik.
Sputnik, man.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a satellite.
Right.
It was a real,
Yeah. A watershed moment.
watershed, that's the word.
Yeah.
This is the world's first artificial satellite.
Right.
And it was launched by the Soviets.
Okay.
Which proved they had the technology to launch these things into orbit.
Great.
Things like ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Which can hit. Anywhere in the globe, essentially.
Across the globe.
Yeah. I mean, that must have been a serious blow to the U.S.
Oh, can't even imagine, yeah.
To, wake up one morning.
Yeah.
And your neighbor, who you're already kind of suspicious of.
Right.
Suddenly has, a high-tech, super-powered sports car.
Yeah, where did they get that?
Yeah, exactly, right?
That's kind of how it must felt.
It changes your perception of them.
Oh, absolutely.
Completely. And that's how the missile gap fear really takes hold in the U.S.
It does, yeah.
This idea that the Soviets are pulling ahead. Technologically.
Yeah.
And they could strike the U.S. mainland with nuclear weapons.
At any moment.
Yeah.
At any moment.
And even if it wasn't entirely accurate, that fear, that perception, it had a real impact on how the U.S. reacted.
For sure.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, later it was revealed that the missile gap was really exaggerated.
Right.
But that perception, that fear, that really fueled U.S. policy. It fueled public opinion.
Of course.
The U.S. poured resources
into trying to close the gap.
Into closing this gap.
Yeah. Which, of course, then just further fuels the arms race.
Which, of course,
It's like a vicious cycle.
It is a vicious cycle.
Yeah. And it's incredible how much power perception holds, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Even a perceived threat can have real-world consequences.
Real-world consequences.
Yeah, absolutely.
But all this fear, all this mistrust, it eventually escalates.
To a point where the whole world is holding its breath, wondering if this standoff is going to end in nuclear annihilation.
Right.
And that brings us to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a more terrifying scenario.
It's up there.
Than the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
October 1962.
Mm-hmm.
The world watches.
Yeah.
For 13 long days.
13 days.
As the U.S. and the Soviet Union are just on the brink of nuclear war.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't get much more intense than that.
It really doesn't, no.
So set the stage for us.
Okay. So it all starts with this discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Okay.
Which, by the way, is just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Yeah, that's close.
That's really close.
That's uncomfortably close.
Yeah, so you can imagine the terror that gripped the nation when this news broke.
Oh, I bet.
Because all of a sudden, the Soviets had the capability of launching a nuclear strike on the U.S. mainland.
Right from their doorstep, essentially.
Yeah.
From their doorstep, incredibly close range.
Yeah.
Changes the whole game.
Wow, so how does the U.S. respond to this?
So Kennedy, he has to act quickly.
Right.
And decisively.
Yeah.
He imposes this naval blockade around Cuba.
Wow.
And demands that the Soviets remove the missiles.
Okay, so a blockade.
A blockade.
That's a bold move.
Bold move, yeah.
Like one wrong step.
Yeah.
One miscalculation and it's poof.
Exactly.
Was.
Incredibly tense standoff.
I bet.
Communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Really strained.
Right.
Threat of escalation hanging over everything.
Wow.
Every single exchange.
It's like trying to, I don't know, disarm a bomb with a pair of tweezers.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
It's like every second just feels critical.
Oh, absolutely. And the world is watching, by the way.
The whole world is holding its breath.
The whole world is holding its breath for 13 days.
Can you imagine 13 days?
It must have felt like an eternity.
Like an eternity, yeah. Just
waiting to see what would happen.
Yeah, finally there's a breakthrough.
Okay.
The Soviets agree to remove the missiles from Cuba.
Okay. Oh, right.
There's always a but.
There's always a but.
Right.
It wasn't quite that simple.
Okay.
The U.S. had to make a concession.
Okay.
They promised not to invade Cuba.
Okay.
And then there was another more secret agreement.
Oh.
The U.S. also agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey.
Okay.
Which had been a major sticking point for the Soviets.
So there's this whole other thing happening behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
That we don't even know about.
Right. We only found out about it later.
Right.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much we don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
About what really went on.
For sure.
In those negotiations.
Yeah.
It also makes you think, like, are there different ways to interpret?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
What happened here?
Yeah.
Different perspectives on the crisis itself.
You've hit on a really important point.
Yeah.
Because the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
It's a prime example.
Okay.
Of how history can be interpreted in different ways.
Okay.
So, you've got the Orthodox view,
yep.
which was the prevailing view during the Cold War.
Right.
This view sees Kennedy's handling of the crisis as a victory for the U.S.
Right.
They forced the Soviets to back down.
Right, which makes sense given the climate at the time.
Exactly, exactly.
But you're saying there are other ways to look at it.
There are, yeah. So then you've got the revisionist view.
Okay.
Which kind of emerged later.
Okay.
And they argued that it was actually U.S. policies.
Okay.
Particularly the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in '61.
Right, right.
That actually provoked the Soviet Union's actions in the first place.
So it's a reaction to U.S. aggression, potentially?
It could be seen that way, yeah.
Wow.
And it doesn't even end there.
Okay.
Because we also have the post-Cold War perspective.
Right.
Which has the benefit of looking at,
That's right. Hindsight.
Previously unavailable Soviet archives.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And these sources kind of suggest that Khrushchev's decision to put missiles in Cuba in the first place,
right.
It was a calculated risk to try to counter what he saw as U.S. nuclear superiority in Europe.
Wow. So it's all about, trying to, level the playing field almost.
Trying to balance things out,
Yeah. So many layers to it.
Many layers, yeah.
So many different interpretations.
It's complex.
Yeah, it makes you appreciate how complex
it really
this period really was.
Yeah.
But regardless of how you interpret the Cuban Missile Crisis, one thing's for sure, it was a turning point.
A turning point, for sure.
Major turning point.
Yeah, it brought the world to the brink.
Yeah.
And it forced both of these superpowers to really confront the horrifying potential consequences of their actions.
Right. This is as close as it gets.
As close as it gets.
To the edge.
Yeah. The world had never felt closer to nuclear war than it did during those 13 days in October 1962.
And what about the people who lived through this? I mean, it's hard for us all these years later to really grasp what it must have been like.
Yeah, the constant tension.
Yeah.
The knowledge that, the fate of the world is resting on the decisions of a few powerful people.
It's heavy.
It's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine, the drills, the bomb shelters, the public service announcements.
Oh.
The fear just woven into everyday life.
Right, because it's not just a one-time thing.
Yeah.
It's this,
it's this constant
becoming threat.
This weight on your shoulders.
Yeah.
This time when popular culture was obsessed with doomsday scenarios.
Of course.
Movies like Dr. Strangelove.
Right.
Really reflecting that absurdity of it all.
It's almost surreal to think about.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Living under that kind of threat?
Yeah.
I mean, it must have shaped an entire generation.
It wasn't just the tangible threat, by the way.
Right.
It's the psychological toll.
Of course.
The arms race, it wasn't just about the weapons themselves.
Right.
It had this profound psychological impact on entire generations.
Wow.
This constant fear of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah.
It just seeped into every aspect of life, shaping worldviews, influencing political discourse, creating this sense of anxiety.
Yeah, just ever present. It's kind of strange to think, isn't it, that something so terrifying, so close to global catastrophe could actually be the thing that pushes both sides towards some kind of control.
Right.
Some attempt to create order from this chaotic arms race.
I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it really was this massive wake-up call.
Yeah.
Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, they looked over the edge of the abyss, and I think they realized just how close they'd come to just completely destroying the world.
Yeah.
And it forced them to acknowledge that this relentless pursuit of nuclear superiority, this idea that more weapons equals more safety, completely unsustainable.
So did the arms race just stop?
Well,
did everyone just take a breath and put down their bombs?
Not exactly. I mean, it didn't exactly happen overnight.
Right.
But the Cuban Missile Crisis, it definitely marked a turning point.
Okay.
The focus starts to shift from just building more and more weapons to trying to actually manage this terrifying technology that they had unleashed.
Right, because now it's out there.
Yeah.
There's no putting it back in the box.
Exactly. The genie's out of the bottle.
And this is where we start to see things like the strategic arms limitation talks, SALT, that we hear about in
history
books.
books.
Right.
Yeah.
So SALT 1 and then SALT 2. Right.
Happening in the late 60s and then into the 70s.
Okay.
These were attempts to actually limit the number of nuclear weapons each side could have.
Okay.
And, you know, these talks, they weren't perfect by any means.
Right.
But they were a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
They at least showed a recognition that dialogue, even if it's tense, even if it's difficult, is a much, much better option than just living with that constant threat of annihilation.
Right. But even with these attempts to, like, you know, control the arms race, even with these talks, it seems like the fear would still linger.
Oh, absolutely.
Like the world had changed.
It did.
There's no going back to a time before nuclear weapons.
Right. The legacy of the arms race it's a complex one.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you know, this competition, as terrifying as it was, it drove some incredible technological innovation.
That's true.
It pushed the boundaries of science and engineering in ways that, frankly, we're still benefiting from today.
Like the space race, for example.
Exactly.
You could argue that our entire journey into space is a direct result of this, like, fierce competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, but, and it's a big but.
Right.
On the other hand, this competition also fostered this climate of fear and paranoia that had a profound impact on global politics.
Right.
And as we talked about, on the lives of millions and billions of people.
Of course.
It's this dark paradox, right?
Yeah.
Incredible innovation, but it's fueled by fear and mistrust.
Yeah, it's like these two sides of the same coin.
Exactly.
You can't have one without the other, seemingly.
It seems that way.
It's a period full of contradictions.
It is.
You know, moments of, like, terrifying brinkmanship, followed by these, like, you know, cautious steps towards diplomacy.
Yeah, trying to find that balance.
It must have been an incredibly difficult and confusing time to live through.
It must have been, to not know what the future holds.
Right, like, is this it?
Exactly.
Is this the end?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the ashes of Hiroshima to the brink of nuclear war in Cuba, from this, like, chilling logic of MAD to those first kind of tentative steps toward arms control.
It's a lot.
It is. Yeah. It's a complex and often terrifying period of history, but one that we absolutely have to understand if we want to navigate the challenges of our own time, right?
I completely agree. I think we have to learn from history.
Of course.
Even the darkest chapters.
Yeah.
If we want to try to create a safer, more peaceful future.
Yeah. The lessons of the Cold War, as you said earlier, they resonate even today.
Absolutely.
They're just as relevant now
100%.
as they were back then.
Yeah.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the complexities of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a topic that continues to fascinate.
Yeah.
And one that hopefully this deep dive has helped to illuminate.
I hope so.
A little bit at least.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah.
And most importantly, keep learning.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.